Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Rath Wang. We've seen new developments in Southeast Asia's two most populous island nations, Indonesia and the Philippines. Typhon, the U.S. intermediate-range missile system that Manila is in talks of acquiring from the U.S., once again have made headlines with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's visit there. Meanwhile, Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, made his first state visit. His first stop was Beijing, meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He then met with President Biden at the White House. We'll discuss what this means for the region as U.S.-China tensions are in no sight of easing. Joining us today are Wen-Ti Sung, Atlantic Council Global China Hub, non-resident fellow, Yinping Su, National Zhengzhi University political science professor. A very warm welcome to both on the show today.
Thank you.
With Austin and the Philippines as a show of the strength of the U.S.-Philippine Security Alliance, all eyes were yet again on the Typhon missile system. We heard Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro say that Manila is planning to acquire them and that his country makes its own decisions despite China's opposition. Professor Su, what do you say to the opposition and in terms of the possibility of the Philippines acquiring this?
Well, first of all, I think it is a little bit too early to say that the acquisition of this missile system will be the game changer amid the tension of South China Sea. But there are two implications behind Philippines' intention to acquire such a system. First, it shows that the Philippines wants to show a signal that it is willing to comply with the new Trump administration's agenda, that the U.S. allies should step up their defense spending and more directly contribute to preserving a U.S.-led international security order. So I think that this signal might make the Trump administration more likely to sell the system. Second, the Philippines actually have already purchased a supersonic anti-ship missile launchers from India. So I think acquiring this new Typhon missile system will further strengthen its defense capability.
Wen-Ti, do you feel the Trump administration, given its history of selling these types of weapons, we've seen a record number of them to Taiwan as well during its first administration, do you feel there will be more of that to U.S. allies here in the region, especially with a growing China in terms of its military intimidation in the region?
I think I agree with Professor Su a lot that Trump obviously talks a lot about getting allies, friends, and partners to play a meaningful role in paying for their own defense. And I think, of course, it's not going to come in the form of actual protection money, so to speak, but it may come in the form of the allies, friends, and partners making more proactive efforts in terms of force building.
To do their part.
Indeed, for sure, because we help those who help themselves, right? Just like the saying goes. So I think in this sense, Trump administration has reason to find ways to further escalate and increase their defense cooperation with Philippines, which is, again, a major ally of the U.S., as well as we know that Filipino voters, Filipino-American voters, let's say, are major voting bloc in the U.S. today. And I think there's both good strategic reasons as well as domestic policy reasons for Trump to be finding ways to increase its cooperation with the Philippines.
Professor Su, speaking of Trump, many say that the Philippines is stuck in between the U.S. and China, geopolitically and also being one of the oldest U.S. allies here. Do you feel that the Philippines could be key in terms of Trump containing China or taking a more aggressive stance towards China?
Oh, yes, that is for sure. Well, first, the U.S. colonized the Philippines from 1898 to 1946. So the two countries used to have a very close historical ties with each other. And the two countries are also strategic partners. So for example, the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty was signed in 1951. And the treaty aims to ensure mutual security in the area surrounding the Philippines, and also it aims to provide a kind of framework for defense cooperation. So this treaty and the recent military cooperation efforts, such as the collective drills between the Philippines and the U.S. will, well, in my view, will play a very important role to deter China's influence in the region.
Wendy, we've also seen Philippine President Marcos Jr. give a call to Trump to congratulate him, and both leaders promised to deepen their cooperation and also to meet as soon as possible. That was similar to what we saw with Tsai Ing-wen, our former president of Taiwan, call with the then President-elect Trump in 2016. Do you feel that this is a precedent with the Philippines and the U.S. having more in terms of military cooperation? It will make Taiwan and the region safer.
I think the short answer is yes. Obviously, Philippines had went through a few years in terms of finding its place in the U.S. China bipolar rivalry in the region. But in more recent years, I think it's becoming very clear that Philippines has decided to take on a more U.S.-friendly approach in that rivalry between U.S. and China. So as part and parcel of that, we're seeing increasing number of U.S. bases and U.S. access to Filipino bases, let's say, in northern Philippines especially, which are facing Taiwan itself and has a commanding role to play in commanding the sea lane communication between Philippines and Taiwan. It's in that sense that Philippines increasingly is a big part of the U.S. strategic chessboard, if you will, on the Eastern Asia as well as the Western Pacific. In that sense, there's every reason to expect that more and more cooperation will be forthcoming in the U.S., Philippines, Taiwan trilateral sense. And with more help, with more networks, I think it's going to be a positive factor for Taiwan's security going forward, as well as that of regional stability, more broadly speaking.
Professor Su, I also wanted to talk a bit more about then candidate Trump did talk about Taiwan, and many here have been concerned in terms of Taiwan being a bit far from the United States, and if China does take action, it makes it difficult for the U.S. to militarily support Taiwan. Do you feel that that is a legitimate concern, given that Trump has also been a bit more insular when compared to the Biden administration in terms of alliances and strengthening more of based on democracy?
I don't feel particularly pessimistic about the future of the regional security in this region because, as we know, that there are several bilateral mutual defense treaties signed in signed in Asia. So, for example, with the U.S. with Japan, and also U.S. with the Philippines, and also with South Korea, and also during Biden's administration, AUKUS was initiated in 2021. So I think after even Trump didn't like the idea of forming a sort of alliance for mutual defense. Probably he or the administration cannot abandon these treaties and also this framework immediately. Probably these alliances might not be as important as usual. The U.S. still try to find a new way to keep its sort of predominant power in the region. But it is clear that the situation will be very different compared to Biden's administration.
Yeah. Let's go back to what Wendy talked about earlier, U.S. bases. Lloyd Austin also visited many bases during his Philippine visit. He stressed that the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty indeed covers the South China Sea, and that the U.S. will continue to support the Philippines. Wendy, why does Washington need Manila on its side?
Well, Manila is critical. We talk about the first island chain, of course, that the vital connection of islands that connect Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia, of which Taiwan and Philippines are two critical nexus along that chain, of course. And also, I think if you look at the map, really Taiwan and Philippines play a pivotal role in checking China's southeastern coast, which means that for China to ever try to explore the possibility of having an ocean-faring blue water navy, it needs to find ways to make sure that it can find a way to for lack of a better word, neutralize Taiwan and Philippines. And it's something that is not in Taiwan nor Philippines' interest, nor in America. And that is why you're seeing America having every incentive to try to find ways to get Philippines onto America's good side. And that's indeed a trend we're seeing in recent years. That again testifies to how important Philippines can be to the region.
Professor Su, how do you see specifically in terms of security the Philippines being pitted?
So, for example, where the Philippines might grant the U.S. with expanded access to the Filipino military bases under the so-called Enhanced Defense Collaboration Agreement, EDCA. And this agreement will allow the U.S. to preposition equipment, conduct joint training, and improve logistical operations. And also, the Philippines could enhance intelligence collaboration with the U.S. So there are multiple ways that the two countries can collaborate.
Could you see action from the Philippines against China or directly against Chinese aggression that the U.S. could actually leverage?
Well, that hasn't happened, but there are small-scale conflicts like on the sea. So, so I think both the all the parties that involved in this region, for example, the U.S., the Philippines, and also some claimant states in South China Sea, pay close attention to this conflict and also try to understand and try to figure out how these potential conflicts can be solved, like, in the short term. Yeah.
Let's now talk about Indonesia. The country just signed a maritime development agreement with China, saying that they'll jointly develop areas with overlapping sovereignty claims. However, the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs quickly followed with a statement clarifying that this agreement did not represent Indonesia's recognition of Chinese sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. It also reiterated that China's claims have no basis in international law and that they are not compliant with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Wen-Chi, Indonesia is Southeast Asia's most populous nation. What do you think Indonesia is trying to do here?
Well, obviously you have a new president coming in for Indonesia, so I think as one of the first go-to moves, there's a tendency to find ways to very visually display their independence. And that has a couple of significance. Of course, A, it creates some subsequent room for maneuver as Indonesia tries to find ways to thread the needle, if you will, between US and China. And B, of course, it enables some room for exploring economic opportunity for Indonesia when it comes to China as well. But at the same time, I think, thirdly, it's exerting independence again is always plays well for domestic nationals audience that consolidates image of a strong leader. But it's important to note that there's that statement from Indonesia's foreign ministry, which is that this visit does not, indeed this agreement does not constitute recognition of China's sovereignty claim. So this is how Indonesia tried to play a balance here, that yes, they're trying to find ways to cooperate with China, but B, they are not ditching their other ASEAN friends and partners behind, those ASEAN friends who may have overlapping sovereignty claim with China in the South China Sea. So this is how I think they're trying to go about it. Of course, also this formula they're talking about here, suspending sovereignty dispute, find room for joint economic cooperation and development. This is not new per se. Indeed, if you look at China's foreign policy history, this really goes back to 1978-79. You see Deng Xiaoping, 4 leaders before the present one, already talking about this formula with Japan, and in the 80s talking about it with Philippines as well. So this, I think, shows China's broader tendency to find ways to leverage a Trump offensive towards Southeast Asia at a time when U.S. itself is going through a leadership transition, and other countries are sort of still trying to find ways to see where is the best place on the spectrum to place a bet. So this, again, I think has broader implications beyond just China, Indonesia themselves.
Professor Su, speaking of the U.S., how do you feel its role is here in terms of Indonesia courting China, but right after going to the White House to talk to President Biden? And as we know, leadership will change in January. Do you feel Indonesia is trying to court both, or do you feel it slightly aims towards one side?
It is very clear that Prabowo, like his predecessor, President Jokowi, both try to strike a delicate balance between the U.S. and China. And in Indonesia, of course, is the major power in Southeast Asian region, and this country is very good at adopting a so-called hedging strategy, and such a strategy indicates that the main goal is to try to strike a balance between different major powers in order to pursue economic development and growth and national security at the same time. And Indonesia is very good at playing this hedging game because it is the largest country and also, in Southeast Asia, and also it is very resourceful, so it has a lot of leverage. And given that China does not pose a direct threat to Indonesia's territory, Indonesia's hedging strategy is mainly to pursue economic benefits. So deepening the Indonesia-U.S. ties is actually in line with Trump's geopolitical strategy in the U.S. foreign policy.
That's to bring Indonesia into more of the U.S. sphere and to push China out in economic terms.
Well, it tries to strike a balance. Like I said, after Prabowo came into power, the first place that he visited is China. So in my view, he didn't want to give other countries and his people's impression that he's 100% for China. So that is why he wants to strike a balance by visiting the U.S. after. Yeah, so I think there is no clear pattern that Indonesia will try to bandwagon any major power, because historically Indonesia has adopted this non-alignment strategy in its foreign policy for such a long time. So I don't think that even the government change, that strategy will also be changed dramatically.
Going back to territorial claims, Indonesia's overlapping territorial claims with China are different from that of the Philippines and Vietnam. Indonesia and China do not have formal disputes, as Professor Su mentioned, in the South China Sea. However, as we can see here, the scope of the 9-dash line claimed by China goes well into the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia's Natuna Islands. In October, Chinese Coast Guard ships entered Indonesia's North Natuna waters 3 times within just a week and were driven out by the Indonesian Coast Guard. With that in mind, Wen-Thi, how do you feel Indonesia will navigate this? Will this new agreement hamper Indonesian efforts to do what it does in its own economic?
It's going to be a challenge for sure. On the one hand, we know that Indonesia definitely want to find ways to create additional economic opportunity for their own people, and that may include not just the U.S. side, but also Chinese market and Chinese resources, perhaps also some opportunity for transfer of Chinese technology and know-how in the process through these kind of joint exploration processes. It is, however, it may make some economic sense, but politically the sustainability remains something that's open to question, I think, because as we've mentioned as well, there are ongoing disputes, there are overlapping claims as well between Indonesia and China, and the fact that you are still seeing signs of gray zone security threats from China towards Indonesia and other good bodies in Indonesia, in ASEAN, Philippines, Vietnam, and what have you. That means that these will be the kind of daily news visuals that voters get to see in Indonesia at high frequency. And when you are seeing yourself, your fishermen, your friends fishermen, facing that kind of challenges from China on a frequent basis, it's hard to see, however, how long this kind of depoliticization of economic cooperation can continue at the era when so many things, including economic security, are so often securitized. So that political delinking of these spheres of policy, it's hard to see how long it can be very sustainable.
Professor Su, how do you see this play out, given that Indonesia doesn't have as big of a stake, say, with the Philippines or with Vietnam, but there are these incursions? Do you feel that it could impact relations with China, or in terms of it being participating with the Belt and Road Initiative. You have investments from China into Indonesia.
Well, I think, first of all, going back to what you just mentioned, actually this maritime development agreement between these between China and Indonesia, on the surface, it is economic because it tries to promote economic cooperation for fisheries and also some maritime issues. So for Indonesia, it is mainly economic, but for China, this agreement might be interpreted as that the one main power in Southeast Asia could be willing to recognize China's sovereign claims, and actually, it also gives a lot of implication for South China Sea claimant states like Vietnam and Philippines. So, I think that to avoid this confusion, that is why the Indonesian government suddenly realized that it doesn't want to give other countries this impression. So it keeps saying that it is not. This treaty is not about recognizing China's claims in South China Sea, and but this agreement is actually a beginning point. Well, actually not in beginning point, but a sort of effort to further deepen the economic relations between Indonesia and China. We know that Indonesia has several important infrastructure projects under the One Belt and One Road initiative. And there are some projects similarly successful but also controversial. So, for example, this railway connecting Jakarta and also Bandung, is controversial because it is similarly too costly. But everyone is paying attention to what will happen, and also I think Indonesia is also trying to find a way to fix this issue.
So, Wendy, do you feel that this agreement in itself is purely in terms of, or heavily focused on economic terms, as Professor Su mentioned, but it is also not a relinquishment of Indonesian sovereignty in its own territory?
Well, it's a bit of both. Honestly, China, obviously, we know is a Chinese Communist Party ruled entity, and we know that in Marxist theory that the economic foundation is the basis for political relations. So in that sense, yes, it seems like an economic policy maneuver, but it's always done with some level of political calculus in mind as well. And the fact that Indonesia, as we know, is the single largest the most potent country in ASEAN, let's say, the first among equals in a sense, obviously will be seen by many countries in the region and beyond as somewhat of a bellwether. And they'll be thinking that if Indonesia is able to find some kind of political modus vivendi with China, then perhaps there's a reason for them to find ways to follow suit as well, which is why that while, yes, it may look like an innocuous economic maneuver, China definitely has a bigger chessboard in mind. And that's why I think there are many reasons to watch this carefully for the months and years to come.
We've also seen Indonesian and Australian armed forces commence joint combat exercises near Indonesia's main island of Java. In mid-November, around 2,000 soldiers participated in air, sea, amphibious, and land combat training. What's worth noting is that Indonesia and Russia also held the first joint Navy exercises in early November. Professor Su, what are the implications of this, given that Indonesia is between Australia and Taiwan and its significance in the region?
Well, actually, compared to Prabowo's visit to the U.S., I think this cooperation between Indonesia and Australia deserves more attention because it is, in my opinion, is more interesting case. Clearly, Australia feels uneasy of facing a rising China, and that is part of the reason that the AUKUS, trilateral security partnership between Australia, the U.S. and the U.K. was initiated in 2021. And in August this year, Australia and Indonesia signed a bilateral defense treaty. And this treaty does not clearly point out that there is a threat in the region, but the purpose of this treaty includes promote information sharing, cooperation on maritime security issues, technology transfer, and even arms sales. And so I believe that is also an effort made by Australia to deter China's threats in the Indo-Pacific region, although Indonesia might not think in that way, but I think overall the implication is pretty clear.
You mentioned that Russia is not the key focus here, but it is also an adversary of the United States. So Winty, you don't see this as an alarm for the U.S. in terms of Indonesia switching sides to, say, the China-Russia alliance?
I mean, obviously, it's also a little bit too early to say whether this constitutes a so-called switching sides per se. I mean, for Indonesia, I think it has a tradition of non-alignment. It also has an omnidirectional diplomacy, a way trying to find ways to be on the good side of everybody.
Thank you very much for both of your insights. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and see you next time.
The White House has announced a $50 billion,
$6.6 billion
billion US dollars
for semiconductor
TSMC's
come out of the 2022 CHIPS Act.
I want competition with China, not conflict.
Taiwan punches above its weight when it comes to creating chips.
The entire world has great interest in keeping Taiwan's chip industry functional.
So the silicon shield that supposedly has been protecting Taiwan, is there a silicon shield?
We take an exclusive look inside one of the 7 chip design firms picked to make India a semiconductor giant.
How many years the TSMC can still maintain its competitive edge?
People here in Japan are calling it the TSMC shock.
Why is Japan so eager to restore its past glory?
What do you see as the next big shift in the semiconductor industry?
Taiwan's take on global headlines. All that matters, Taiwan Plus.